She risked her life to hide a bleeding stranger from his enemies, never knowing that years later, that same man would return with a fleet of Rolls-Royces to claim a debt of honor the city had forgotten. In the dim neon haze of a late-night diner, Monique Harris lived a life of quiet exhaustion. She had no powerful allies, no shield against the predatory men who wanted her land, and no reason to believe a miracle would ever walk through her door. But one rainy night, when a dying man collapsed in her alley, she chose courage over safety. That single act of mercy put a target on her back for years and would eventually turn her into the most protected woman in the world. The neon sign above the diner buzzed with a rhythmic, dying flicker, casting a sickly pink glow over the rain-slicked pavement of the empty parking lot. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old grease, burnt coffee, and the metallic tang of a radiator that had seen better decades. Monique Harris wiped a damp rag across the Formica counter for the 100th time that night, her movements slow and mechanical. At 52, her body was a map of the service industry, the constant ache in her lower back, the swollen knuckles, and the tired lines around her eyes that even the dim lighting couldn't hide. She looked at the clock, 2:14 a.m. The graveyard shift was a ghost town tonight, which was both a blessing and a curse. A curse because the tip jar held nothing but a lonely $5 bill and a handful of copper. A blessing because it meant she could rest her feet for 5 minutes before the early morning truckers started rolling in. Monique sighed, her breath fogging slightly in the drafty room. Her thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the letter sitting on her kitchen table upstairs. It was a formal notice from Mr. Henderson, her landlord, draped in legal jargon that boiled down to a single, terrifying ultimatum. Pay the 3 months of back rent by Friday or hand over the keys to the diner. This place was all she had left of her father, a man who had flipped burgers for 40 years to ensure Monique had a roof over her head. The thought of losing him felt like losing him all over again. A sudden sharp thud from the back alley broke the silence. Monique froze, her hand tightening around the rag. In this neighborhood, noise after midnight usually meant trouble. She waited, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Usually, she would just lock the deadbolt and ignore it, but the sound hadn't been the metallic clang of a dumpster or the skittering of a stray cat. It had been heavy, solid, human. Grabbing a heavy rolling pin from the prep station, a meager defense but the only one she had, Monique edged toward the back door. She cracked it open just an inch. The rain was coming down in sheets now, blurring the world into shades of charcoal and silver. At first, she saw nothing but the overflowing trash bins. Then she looked down. A man was slumped against the brick wall, half hidden in the shadows of the industrial fridge unit. He was dressed in a suit that looked more expensive than Monique's entire apartment, though the fine gray wool was now shredded and soaked with a mixture of rainwater and something much darker. His head was bowed, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, and his breath came in ragged, wet gasps. "Hey," Monique whispered, her voice trembling. "You all right?" The man didn't move. Monique stepped out into the rain, the cold water instantly soaking through her pink uniform. As she got closer, she saw the trail of red smeared against the white bricks behind him. This wasn't just a stumble. He had been hunted. She reached out, tentatively touching his shoulder. The man flinched, his head snapping up with a speed that made her gasp. His eyes were dark, sharp, and filled with a terrifying, primal intensity, even as his face remained deathly pale. He looked at Monique, then at the rolling pin in her hand, and for a fleeting second, a ghost of a grimace, perhaps a smile, perhaps a snarl, crossed his lips. "No, police," he rasped. His voice was a jagged edge of gravel and pain. He spoke with a slight accent, his hand clutching his side where the blood was blooming like a dark rose through his white shirt. Monique looked toward the mouth of the alley. Far off, the screech of tires echoed against the tall buildings, followed by the rhythmic flash of headlights sweeping across the wet pavement. Someone was looking for him. She looked back at the man. He was a stranger, a bloody shadow that brought the scent of danger and expensive tobacco into her world. Everything in her life taught her to stay invisible, to stay out of trouble, to mind her own business so the world wouldn't crush her any further. But as she looked into his eyes, she didn't see a criminal or a threat. She saw someone who was just as cornered by life as she was. "Can you stand?" she asked, dropping the rolling pin and reaching out both hands. He didn't answer, his eyes already beginning to glaze over as his body surrendered to the trauma. He started to tilt sideways, his weight shifting toward the puddles. Without thinking of the consequences, Monique caught him. His body was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and damp fabric. Gritting her teeth against the flare of pain in her back, she hoisted his arm over her shoulder. She smelled the rain, the blood, and a faint, lingering scent of sandalwood. "Come on," she hissed, dragging him toward the heavy steel door of the diner. "Inside, now." As she pulled him into the warmth of the kitchen and kicked the door shut, locking the 3 separate bolts with a series of frantic clicks, the headlights of a black SUV slowed at the entrance of the alley. Monique leaned her back against the door, her breath coming in ragged bursts, holding the unconscious stranger in her arms. The bloody shadow had arrived, and with him, the quiet life of Monique Harris ended forever. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing out the roar of the rain, but the silence inside the diner was even more deafening. Monique stood breathless, her back pressed against the metal, the weight of the unconscious man slumped against her like a leaden anchor. Blood, thick, dark, and smelling of iron, smeared the front of her pink uniform, ruining the fabric she spent every Sunday bleaching. She looked down at the man, Kang Dong-chul, whose face was a mask of porcelain pain, and for a heartbeat she considered the madness of her choice. To harbor a man like this was to invite the storm inside. A sudden flash of light swept across the high, narrow windows of the kitchen. A car had pulled into the parking lot. "Oh, Lord," Monique whispered, her voice hitching. She didn't have minutes, she had seconds. She couldn't take him to the apartment upstairs. The stairs groaned too loudly, and they would see her through the glass front of the diner. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, landing on the walk-in pantry at the far end of the prep line. It was a cramped space filled with industrial-sized cans of tomatoes and bags of flour, but it was the only place with a heavy enough door to muffle a groan. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, Monique hooked her arms under his armpits and dragged him across the linoleum. He was a dead weight, his heels scuffing the floor, leaving a faint, shimmering trail of red. She rolled him into the pantry, tucking his long legs behind a crate of onions. "Stay quiet," she breathed, though he was far beyond hearing her. She shut the pantry door just as the bells above the front entrance let out a sharp, discordant jangle. Monique grabbed a bucket of soapy water and a mop, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She splashed the water over the scuff marks on the floor, scrubbing with a ferocity that turned her knuckles white. By the time the kitchen's swinging doors pushed open, she was bent over the mop, her face glistening with a mixture of steam and cold sweat. 3 men walked in. They didn't look like the usual late-night crowd. They wore dark, rain-drenched windbreakers over sharp clothes, and their eyes moved with a predatory efficiency, cataloging every corner of the room. The man in the lead had a jagged scar running through his eyebrow and a smile that didn't reach his cold, flat eyes. "We're closed for cleaning, fellas," Monique said, her voice steadier than she felt. She didn't look up, focusing on the suds swirling on the floor. "Is that right?" the lead man asked, his voice a low, grating hum. He walked toward the back door, his boots clicking on the tile. He stopped right where Monique had been standing moments before. He looked at the door, then turned back to her. "We're looking for a friend, a stray dog, let's say. Tall, expensive suit, probably bleeding. He come through here?" Monique leaned on the mop handle, wiping her forehead with the back of her sleeve, careful to use the arm that wasn't stained with blood. "I've seen plenty of strays tonight, mostly the 4-legged kind, looking for a scrap."
If your friend has money for a suit, he wouldn't be hanging around a greasy spoon like this at 3 in the morning. The man stepped closer, the air around him smelling of wet asphalt and something chemical. He leaned over the counter, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the front of her apron. Monique felt her breath hitch. The pink fabric was damp and darkened. "That's a lot of juice on your apron, sweetheart," he remarked, reaching out a gloved hand toward her. "Strawberry pie filling," Monique snapped, pulling back with a scowl of practiced indignation. "The industrial can exploded during prep. If you want to help me scrub it out of the grout, you're welcome to stay. Otherwise, I've got a floor to finish and a landlord who will have my head if this place isn't sparkling by dawn." The man stared at her, his gaze heavy and suspicious. Behind him, the other two began opening the industrial fridge and peeking under the prep tables. One moved toward the pantry. Monique's stomach did a slow, sickening flip. She saw the man's hand reach for the pantry handle. If he opened it, if Deng Shul so much as exhaled, it was over. "Hey!" she shouted, the volume making all three men jump. She pointed the mop at the man near the pantry. "You touch those onions and you're buying the whole crate. I don't know who you think you are, but this is a place of business, not a playground for thugs. Get out before I trip the silent alarm for the precinct 2 blocks over." It was a bluff. The alarm had been broken for 3 years, but she said it with the weary, dangerous authority of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The lead man looked at the pantry, then back at Monique's defiant, wide-eyed stare. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the rain drumming on the roof. "Precinct is busy tonight, lady. Lots of accidents happening," the lead man said, though he signaled to his partners. He took a step back, his eyes lingering on her one last time. "If we find out you're lying, we won't be asking about strawberry pie next time." They turned and walked out, the swinging doors fluttering in their wake. Monique waited, frozen, until she heard the roar of their engine fade into the distance. Only then did she drop the mop. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the wet floor, her breath coming in great shuddering gasps. She crawled to the pantry and pulled the door open. Deng Shul was still there, his head lolling against the bags of flour, a ghost in her kitchen. She had chosen. She had lied to the wolves to save the lion, and as she looked at the silver dragon coin that had fallen from his pocket onto the floor, she knew the world she lived in had just grown much, much smaller. The pantry was a small, quiet world that smelled of earth and dry grain, a stark contrast to the predatory silence that had filled the diner moments before. Monique knelt on the hard tile, her knees popping as she reached for the first aid kit she kept tucked behind the industrial-sized sacks of flour. It was a metal box, rusted at the hinges, containing only the basics: antiseptic, gauze, a needle, and some heavy-duty thread. She had patched up many scrapes from kitchen accidents over the years, but she had never looked into the literal mouth of a wound like the one currently gaping in the stranger's side. Deng Shul had regained a sliver of consciousness, though his eyes remained unfocused, drifting between the low-hanging light bulb and Monique's steady face. As she cut away his ruined shirt, the true scale of the violence he had escaped became clear. It wasn't just one wound, it was a map of a life lived in the dark. Old scars, jagged and white, crisscrossed his torso, but the fresh one, a deep, jagged slice from a blade, was the priority. "This is going to bite," Monique whispered, more to steady herself than him. She poured the antiseptic. Deng Shul's body convulsed, his hand flying out to grip her wrist with a strength that made her bones ache. He didn't scream. Instead, he let out a low, guttural hiss, his knuckles turning white as he stared at her. "Easy, Mr. Expensive Suit," she murmured, gently but firmly prying his fingers loose. "I'm the only thing standing between you and a body bag. You need to stay with me." As she began the painstaking work of stitching the skin, the silence between them began to fill with the weight of unsaid things. To keep him focused, to keep him from slipping back into the dark, Monique started to talk. She told him about the diner, how her father had bought it with the money he saved from 3 jobs, and how the grill had a specific heartbeat you had to listen for. She told him about the landlord, Mr. Henderson, whose greed was slowly suffocating the life out of the only home she had ever known. "He wants the deed," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she pulled a stitch tight. "The neighborhood is changing. They call it revitalization, but for people like me, it just means being erased. I'm 3 months behind, and I think he's tired of waiting." Dong Chul watched her, his breathing beginning to level out. The sharp, lethal edge in his eyes had softened into something resembling curiosity. He reached out with his steady hand, touching the edge of her stained pink apron. "You risked your life for a shadow," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Why?" Monique didn't look up from her work. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted, maybe not by men with knives, but by a world that doesn't care if you live or die. My daddy used to say that a person's worth isn't measured by what they have, but by what they're willing to protect." She tied off the last stitch and sat back, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. "There, you won't be running any marathons, but you'll live."
Dong Chul looked down at the neat black thread against his pale skin. He looked at the humble surroundings, the sacks of flour, the smell of onions, the weary woman in the stained uniform. He lived in a world of glass towers, black sedans, and blood oaths, where loyalty was bought and sold like a commodity. Yet here, in a pantry that cost less than his shoes, he had found a brand of loyalty that was absolute and free. "The men who came here," he began, his voice gaining a sliver of its former authority, "they are part of a coup. They think they have killed the head of the dragon. They do not realize the dragon has a memory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver dragon coin Monique had seen earlier. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers cold but his grip certain. "Keep this, Monique Harris. In my world, this is more than silver. It is a debt that the world tried to erase tonight, but I do not forget." Monique looked at the coin, its intricate scales shimmering in the dim light. She didn't understand the world of mafia bosses or internal coups, but she understood the look in his eyes. It was the same look her father had when he made a promise. "I don't need silver," she said softly, closing her hand over it anyway. "I just need you to get better so you can get out of here before they come back." "They will come back," Dong Chul said, his eyes fixated on the pantry door. "But next time, they will not be looking for a stray dog. They will be looking for a king. And when I sit on my throne again, I will remember the woman in the pink apron who gave me a kingdom in a pantry." For the first time in years, as she sat on the floor of her failing diner, she didn't feel quite so alone. The landlord was still coming, the debts were still mounting, but she had a secret tucked in her hand, a silver dragon that whispered of a storm yet to come. The morning light was a thin, watery gray, barely managing to pierce the grime on the diner's front windows. Monique had spent the last few hours of the darkness sitting on a milk crate in the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the pantry door, drifting in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep. Every creak of the building made her heart jolt, every distant siren sounding like a final warning. When the sun finally climbed high enough to turn the neon open sign into a dull, lifeless tube of glass, she stood up, her joints popping in the silence. She needed to check his fever. She needed to see if the man she had risked everything for had survived the night. She pulled the pantry door open, the scent of antiseptic and dry flour hitting her instantly, but the space was empty.
The crate of onions had been moved back into place, and the blood-stained towels she had used to prop up his head were neatly folded on a bag of rice. There was no sign of a struggle, no lingering shadow of the violence that had brought him there, only the faint, disappearing scent of sandalwood and the chill of the morning air. Monique rushed to the back door. The heavy steel bolts were slid back, the door slightly ajar. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the alleyway gleaming like obsidian. There were no footprints, no black sedans idling in the mist, no trail of blood. Kang Dong Chul had vanished, as if he had never been more than a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and the fear of losing her diner. Gone, she whispered, the word feeling heavy in her mouth. She felt a sudden sharp pang of loss, not for the man himself, but for the strange, fleeting connection they had shared in the dark. For a few hours, she hadn't just been a waitress drowning in debt, she had been a protector, a person of consequence. Now she was just Monique again, alone in a kitchen that was falling apart. She turned back to the pantry to begin the grim task of scrubbing away the evidence of his stay. As she reached for the folded towels, something bright caught the morning light, shimmering against the dark tile floor. She knelt and picked it up. It was the silver dragon coin. Yesterday it had been a curiosity, a piece of metal passed between a dying man and a desperate woman. But now, as she held it in the light, the detail was staggering. The dragon was coiled in a perfect circle, its scales so fine they felt like a heartbeat under her thumb. Its eyes were tiny rubies, glowing with a cold, ancient fire. It felt impossibly heavy for its size, as if it were weighted with the gravity of 1,000 secrets. There was no note, no written promise of money or safety. In his world, words were dangerous and paper was a trail. The coin was the message. It was a tether, a physical manifestation of a debt that transcended the laws of the city. Monique tucked the coin into the hidden pocket of her uniform, the cold metal pressing against her hip. She walked to the front of the diner and looked out at the street. The neighborhood was waking up. The trash trucks were rummaging through the bins, and the first of the early morning commuters were walking past, heads down, ignoring the for lease signs that were popping up on the block like tombstones. She saw Mr. Henderson's black car cruise slowly past the diner, a shark circling its prey. He didn't stop, but the message was clear. Friday was coming. The debt to the world was due, and she had no way to pay it. She reached into her pocket and gripped the silver dragon. Dong Chul had left her with a promise he couldn't speak, a vow of loyalty that felt as fragile as glass in the face of her mounting bills. She had saved a king, but the king was gone, and the wolves were still at her door. Monique took a deep breath, straightened her stained apron, and turned on the coffee urn. The hiss of the steam filled the empty room, a lonely sound in a big city. She had a coin, she had a secret, and for the first time in a long time, she had a reason to keep her head up. She didn't know when or how the dragon would return, but as she wiped down the first counter of the day, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't sign over the deed. Not today. Not as long as the silver was still warm in her pocket. The seasons did not change so much as they bled into one another, marked only by the shifting temperature of the rain against the diner's windows. 5 years drifted by in a haze of steam and grease, each one etching a new map of exhaustion onto Monique's face. The silver dragon coin remained tucked into a secret velvet pouch sewn into the lining of her uniform, a cold weight against her hip that served as her only anchor. Without it, she feared she might simply drift away, dissolved by the relentless grind of a life that demanded everything and gave back nothing. Her shifts grew longer, stretching from the graveyard hours into the breakfast rush as she cut her staff to the bare bones. She was the waitress, the cook, and the janitor. Her ankles remained perpetually swollen, and her breath began to come in shallow, labored hitches that she tried to ignore. The revitalization of the neighborhood had accelerated. The humble brick buildings of her childhood were being swallowed by glass and steel monoliths that housed boutiques where a single shirt cost more than her monthly revenue. Through it all, her diner remained a stubborn, faded pink island in a sea of corporate chrome. Mr. Henderson was no longer a shark circling from a distance. He had become a constant, suffocating presence. He no longer sent letters. Instead, he would appear at the counter during her slowest hours, leaning his expensive wool coat against the stained formica, watching her with a look of predatory patience. He had stopped asking for the back rent. Now he only spoke of the deed, his voice a silk-wrapped threat that made the hair on her arms stand up. "You look tired, Monique," he said one Tuesday afternoon, his eyes tracking the slight tremor in her hands as she poured his coffee. "This place is a coffin. Why spend your last good years scrubbing floors for ghosts? Sign the papers. Walk away with enough to retire in a house that doesn't smell like old onions." "The ghosts are my family, Mr. Henderson," Monique replied, her voice raspy but firm, "and I don't plan on leaving them behind." But the cost of her defiance was written in the darkening circles under her eyes. To keep the lights on, she took a second job cleaning offices in the high-rises across town, working from 4 in the morning until the diner opened at 8. She lived on caffeine and the memory of a sandalwood scent that had long since faded from her pantry. There were nights, deep in the hollow hours of 3 a.m., when she would pull the silver coin from her pocket and stare at the ruby eyes of the dragon. She would remember the weight of the man in her arms and the absolute certainty in his voice when he called himself a king. But kings did not return to neighborhoods like this. As the years piled up, the coin began to feel less like a promise and more like a taunt. The world didn't care about a debt of honor, it only cared about the bottom line. Her health began to fail in earnest, a persistent cough that tasted of copper, a dizzy spell that sent her crashing into the prep table, bruising her ribs. She was grinding her teeth down to the nerves just to keep from screaming at the unfairness of it all. The neighborhood bullies, emboldened by Henderson's protection, began to loiter by her back door, mocking her strawberry pie apron and hinting that the diner's time was running out. She felt the walls closing in, the debt mounting until it was a mountain she could no longer climb. Every morning she woke up, her bones felt like they were made of dry glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. She was a woman holding back a tidal wave with a mop, waiting for a dragon that had surely forgotten she existed. Yet every time her fingers brushed the cold metal of the coin, she found one more hour of strength, one more day of resolve, refusing to let the shadows win. The humidity of the late August afternoon clung to the diner like a wet wool blanket, making the air inside thick and suffocating, despite the 2 oscillating fans whirring fruitlessly on the counter. Monique was bent over the sink, her hands submerged in gray, lukewarm water, when the bell above the door gave a sharp, definitive jingle. She didn't need to look up to know the rhythm of those footsteps. They were heavy, polished, and devoid of the hesitant shuffle of a hungry customer. Mr. Henderson did not sit down this time. He stood in the center of the linoleum floor, his shadow stretching long and dark across the prep station. Behind him, 2 men Monique had never seen before stood silhouetted against the streetlights, broad-shouldered shadows in cheap suits, their presence turning the cozy diner into a cage. "It's over, Monique," Henderson said, his voice stripped of his usual oily charm. It was flat now, a cold pronouncement. Monique dried her hands on her apron, her movements slow to hide the tremor in her fingers. "I told you, Henderson, the taxes are almost caught up. I just need another month." "You don't have a month. You don't even have a weekend." Henderson stepped closer, leaning over the counter until she could smell the peppermint on his breath and the expensive cologne that didn't quite mask the stench of greed. He dropped a thick manila envelope on the formica. It landed with a heavy final thud. "That's the final deed transfer. You sign it by tomorrow evening, or the city inspectors will find enough code violations in this kitchen to shut you down by midnight. And if that doesn't work..." He paused, his eyes darted towards the back door, the same door through which a bleeding man had once vanished.
"Accidents happen to old buildings, Monique," he whispered, leaning in closer. "Faulty wiring, gas leaks. A woman working late, all by herself, could get hurt. Very badly hurt. You're a smart woman. Don't let your pride burn you alive." Monique felt a coldness settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the failing air conditioning. It was the chill of absolute vulnerability. She looked at the 2 men by the door. They were watching her with the bored, vacant expressions of people who broke things for a living. She thought of her father, of the decades of sweat soaked into these walls, and then she thought of the silver coin tucked against her skin. "You're threatening to burn down my father's life?" Her voice was a low rasp, vibrating with a cocktail of terror and fury. I'm offering you a way out, Henderson countered, straightening his tie. 24 hours. Tomorrow at sunset, I come back for the signature. If the pen hasn't touched the paper by then, well, I'd suggest you make sure your insurance is paid up, though insurance won't help you if you're inside when the lights go out. He turned on his heel, his entourage trailing out behind him. The bell rang one last time, a lonely, tinny sound that seemed to signal the end of an era. Monique sank onto a stool, her legs finally giving way. The diner was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator that sounded more like a death rattle. She reached into her hidden pocket and pulled out the silver dragon coin. For 5 years it had been her secret strength, a silent promise from a man who lived in a world of shadows and blood. But as she looked at the tiny ruby eyes of the dragon, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. Dong Chol was gone. He was a ghost, a memory from a rainy night that felt a lifetime ago. He wasn't coming to save her from a local landlord and a pair of hired thugs. She was a middle-aged waitress in a stained apron, and the world was finally coming to collect the debt of her defiance. She held the coin tight, the metal edges biting into her palm until it drew blood. She had 24 hours. She could run, she could sign, or she could wait for the fire. But as she looked at the empty alleyway through the back window, she remembered the way the Mafia boss had looked at her when she stitched his skin, not with pity, but with a recognition of a shared spirit. A person's worth isn't measured by what they have, she whispered to the empty room, repeating her father's mantra, but by what they're willing to protect. She stood up, wiped the tears from her face with her grime-streaked sleeve, and began to prep the coffee for the morning. She wouldn't run. She would be right here, behind her counter, when the sun went down. If the dragon didn't show, she would meet the fire on her own feet.
The sun dipped below the jagged skyline, bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the city and casting long, skeletal shadows over the diner's floor. Monique stood behind the counter, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly over the silver coin in her pocket. She had spent the last hour meticulously polishing the same spot on the formica, her eyes fixed on the front door. The air was thick and expectant, the kind of heavy stillness that precedes a devastating storm. The bell chimed with a violent jolt. Mr. Henderson marched in, flanked not by 2 men this time, but by 4. They moved with a jagged, aggressive energy, kicking aside the chairs and overturning a clean-up-in-progress sign. Henderson's face was flushed, his eyes darting with a frantic, desperate greed. He didn't speak. He simply slapped the deed onto the counter and unsheathed a heavy gold pen, clicking it with a rhythmic, menacing snap. "Time's up, Monique," he growled. "Sign it, now, or we start with the windows and end with the kitchen." "I'm not signing," Monique said, her voice a low, steady hum that surprised even her. "This is my father's house. You have no right." Henderson's face twisted into a mask of pure malice. He signaled to the men behind him. One of them stepped forward, his hand wrapping around the collar of Monique's pink uniform, his knuckles grazing her throat. He pulled her forward until she was chest to chest with the counter, the smell of cheap tobacco and stale sweat filling her lungs. "You think this is a game?" Henderson hissed, leaning into her personal space. "I told you accidents happen. Last chance, old woman. Sign the paper or I let them take what they want from this place, starting with you." The man holding her raised a heavy closed fist, his eyes fixed on her temple. Monique closed her eyes, her thumb tracing the scales of the silver dragon one last time. She braced for the impact, for the sound of shattering glass, for the end of the only world she had ever known. But the blow never landed. Instead, a sound cut through the tension, a low, rhythmic purr that didn't belong in this neighborhood. It wasn't the rattling roar of a city bus or the screech of a modified muffler. It was the sound of precision engineering, a deep, velvet hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Monique's bones. The man holding her froze, his fist suspended in midair. Through the front windows, the streetlights were suddenly drowned out by a sequence of blindingly white LED beams. One by one, 3 massive, obsidian-black Rolls-Royces glided to the curb with the synchronized grace of predators. They didn't just stop, they claimed the street. The heavy doors didn't slam, they closed with a soft, expensive thud that seemed to suck the sound out of the entire block. The silence that followed was absolute. The neighborhood traffic stopped. The loiterers on the corner vanished into the shadows. Even the flickering neon sign above the diner seemed to steady its pulse. Henderson let go of the pen, his mouth hanging slightly agape as he stared at the line of vehicles. These weren't the cars of local city councilmen or small-time developers. These were the chariots of kings.
The men in the diner backed away from Monique, their bravado evaporating like mist in the sun. They looked at each other, then at the street, their hands dropping to their sides. "Who is that?" Henderson stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "Who the hell is that?" Monique leaned against the prep station, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She watched as the rear doors of the center car swung open. A man stepped out, his polished leather shoes hitting the wet pavement with a decisive click. He was draped in a tailored black overcoat that looked like it was woven from shadows, and even from behind the glass, Monique could feel the cold, lethal authority radiating from him. He didn't look at the neighborhood. He didn't look at the luxury cars. He looked directly at the faded pink sign of the diner. Monique felt a shiver of recognition. The man was older, his face more angular, his presence vastly more imposing than the bleeding shadow she had stitched in a pantry 5 years ago. But the way he stood, with the unshakable weight of a man who owned the ground he walked on, was unmistakable. The dragon had returned, and he hadn't come alone. The heavy silence that had settled over the street deepened as the other 2 car doors opened in perfect, haunting synchronization. From the first and third Rolls-Royces, 2 more men stepped onto the pavement. They were younger than the man in the center, but they moved with the same terrifying liquid grace, shoulders broad, spines straight, their expressions masked by identical dark sunglasses that reflected the diner's flickering neon sign. They were dressed identically in suits that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the city. White shirts, crisp enough to cut glass, were cinched by narrow black ties. They didn't speak. They didn't look at the crowd of onlookers beginning to gather at the edges of the sidewalk. They simply walked toward the center car, flanking the man in the charcoal overcoat like the 2 edges of a blade. Inside the diner, Henderson's 4 hired thugs had backed away from the windows, their aggressive stances collapsing into a frantic, huddled retreat. They were predators who understood the hierarchy of the streets, and they realized instantly that they were no longer the apex in the room. The man who had been holding Monique's collar now stood with his hands raised slightly, a reflexive gesture of surrender. "Who are they, Henderson?" one of the thugs hissed, his voice cracking. "That's not the city council. That's something else." Henderson didn't answer. He was staring at the man in the center. Kang Dong-chul. The Mafia boss didn't rush. He crossed the sidewalk with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes never leaving Monique's. To the neighborhood, he was a nightmare in silk and wool, a projection of a world where laws were replaced by legacies. But to Monique, as he stepped through the door and the bells gave a soft, intimidated chime, the ghost she had been feeding with her own hope for 5 long years.
The 2 men in black suits followed him inside, positioned themselves by the entrance, and crossed their arms. Their presence felt like a physical weight, pushing the air out of the room. They projected a level of power that was alien to this block, a cold, organized authority that made Henderson's local brand of bullying look like a child's tantrum. Dong-chul stopped 3 paces from the counter. He ignored Henderson entirely, treating the landlord as if he were nothing more than a smudge of grease on the floor. He looked at Monique, his gaze sweeping over her tired eyes, the deepening lines on her face, and the faded pink fabric of the uniform she was still wearing. "You look exactly as I remembered," he said. His voice was no longer the jagged rasp of a dying man. It was a deep, resonant baritone that commanded the space around him. Except for the exhaustion. That I did not authorize. Monique felt a sob catch in her throat, but she swallowed it down, her hand still clenching the silver coin in her pocket. "You took your time," she whispered, her voice trembling. A ghost of a smile touched Dong Chul's lips, the same grimace she had seen in the rain 5 years ago. "Reclaiming a throne takes more than a day, Monique Harris, and a king does not return to his savior empty-handed." He finally turned his head, his eyes locking onto Henderson. The landlord flinched as if he had been struck. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop 10 degrees. The men in the black suits shifted their weight, their movements subtle but menacing, like wolves waiting for the signal to strike. Henderson tried to speak, tried to reclaim his stolen bravado, but under the weight of Dong Chul's stare, the words died in his throat. Monique watched them, the man she had saved and the soldiers he brought with him. It was a different world, one built on blood and absolute loyalty, and it had just collided with her humble diner. The bloody shadow had returned as a son, and for the first time in her life, Monique realized that she wasn't just being saved, she was being honored. The debt the world had tried to erase was about to be paid in full. Dong Chul stepped deeper into the diner, the clicking of his heels on the linoleum sounding like the ticking of a clock reaching 0. He finally turned his attention to Henderson, who was trembling so violently that the gold pen slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. The Mafia boss looked at the manila envelope on the counter, the instrument of Monique's ruin, and picked it up with 2 fingers as if it were a piece of rotting refuse. "Mr. Henderson," said Dong Chul, his voice deceptively soft, yet carrying a resonance that made the window panes hum. "You have spent the last 5 years believing that this woman was alone. You looked at this diner and saw an old building to be razed. You looked at her and saw a waitress who could be broken. You were wrong on both counts."
I was just conducting business," Henderson stammered, his eyes darting toward his 4 hired men, who were now standing so still they looked like statues. "She owes back rent. I have every legal right." "You have no rights in a world you do not understand," Dong Chul interrupted. He gestured to one of the men in black suits, who stepped forward and handed him a leather folder. "You spoke of accidents, Henderson. You spoke of fire and faulty wiring. Did you think I wasn't listening? Did you think a king would leave his most precious debt unguarded?" He opened the folder and dropped a stack of photographs onto the counter. Henderson's face went from pale to a ghostly translucent. The photos weren't of the diner. They were of Henderson. Henderson meeting with city inspectors in dark bars, Henderson handing envelopes of cash to the neighborhood thugs. Most damningly, there were time-stamped photos of Henderson's men scouting the diner's gas lines only 3 hours ago. "I have been watching through your eyes for 5 years, Dong Chul said, turning back to Monique. His expression softened, the lethal coldness in his eyes flickering into something resembling warmth. "Every double shift you worked, every time you cleaned those offices across town just to keep this grill hot, I saw it all. I wanted to come sooner, but a dragon must first burn away the traitors in his own house before he can build a home for his friends." He looked back at the landlord, his voice dropping to a jagged, terrifying whisper. "I bought the bank that holds your mortgage this morning, Henderson. By noon tomorrow, your assets will be frozen. By sunset, these photographs and the recordings my men have gathered of your threats will be sitting on the desk of a federal prosecutor who owes me a very large favor. You came here to take her legacy. Instead, you have lost your own." Colombe collapsed onto one of the stools, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his men, but they were already backing toward the door, realizing that their employer was a dead man walking. "Get out," Dong Chul commanded. It wasn't a shout, it was a decree.
Henderson scrambled to his feet, grabbing his coat and stumbling toward the exit. His thugs followed, tripping over each other in their haste to reach the safety of the dark street. The bells above the door gave one last frantic jangle before silence reclaimed the diner. Dong Chol turned to Monique. He reached across the counter and gently took her hand, the hand that had stitched his side in the dark. He felt the calluses, the burns, and the tremor of 5 years of sustained fear finally beginning to break. The debt is not settled, Monique Harris. It can never be settled. But the fire you feared has been extinguished. From this moment on, you are not just a waitress. You are the woman who saved the dragon, and the world is going to learn exactly what that means. Monique looked at him, the tears she had held back since the night of the rain finally spilling over. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver coin, laying it on the counter between them. It shimmered in the neon light, the tiny ruby eyes of the dragon glowing like embers.
I kept it, she whispered. I know, Dong Chol replied. It was the only light I had while I was in the dark. The 2 men in black suits stepped outside, taking their positions as sentinels at the door. The 3 Rolls-Royces remained idling at the curb, their headlights cutting through the city's gloom like beacons. The predator was gone. The debt was recognized, and for the first time in her life, Monique Harris felt the heavy, golden weight of true protection. The morning after the storm did not bring the usual gray fatigue. Instead, the sun rose with a brilliance that seemed to scrub the city clean. Monique stood by the front window, watching as 2 nondescript sedans pulled away from Henderson's office across the street. She had watched from a distance as men in dock windbreakers carried out boxes of files and hard drives, the physical remains of a predatory empire being dismantled by the evidence Dong Chol's men had gathered over half a decade. Henderson himself had been let out in handcuffs at dawn, his expensive wool coat draped over his head in a vain attempt to hide from a world that had finally stopped fearing him. Inside the diner, the air felt lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled. The 3 men in black suits remained, though they had traded their intimidating stance for a quiet, efficient helpfulness. They didn't flip burgers, but they stood guard at the doors, ensuring that for the first time in years, Monique could work without looking over her shoulder. Dong Chol sat at the far end of the counter, the same spot where he had once collapsed in a heap of blood and rain. He was nursing a cup of coffee, his charcoal overcoat draped over the stool beside him. He looked at the golden diner sign, a new polished brass plaque that his men had installed overnight to replace the cracked plastic one. "The deed is in your name, Monique," Dong Chol said, his voice quiet but absolute. "Not as a lease, and not as a gift from a bank. It is yours. My lawyers have ensured that no city inspector or developer will ever find a code violation on this block again. This ground is now sovereign." Monique stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. For 5 years, her identity had been tied to the struggle, the grinding teeth, the swollen ankles, the constant shadow of the landlord. That shadow was gone, replaced by a golden light that felt almost heavy in its brilliance. "I don't know how to thank you, Dong Chol," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she finally didn't have to suppress. "I was just doing what was right. I didn't do it for a deed." "I know," Dong Chol replied, standing up and walking toward her. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the scars and calluses that told the story of her resilience. "Most people save a life because they want to be a hero. You saved me because you couldn't bear to see a person broken. You gave me a pantry when I was a shadow. I give you a kingdom now that I am a king." He signaled to one of the men by the door, who stepped forward with a small, velvet-lined box. Dong Chol opened it, revealing a small, intricate pin made of solid gold.
A dragon identical to the silver coin, but with eyes made of deep, shimmering emeralds. The silver coin was a promise, he whispered, pinning the dragon to the collar of her pink uniform. This gold is the reality. It means that from this day forward, you are under the protection of the dragon. If a light bulb flickers, my men will fix it. If a supplier tries to overcharge you, they will answer to me. You will never work a double shift out of fear again. Monique looked at the two men at the door, then back at the man who had become the son she never had and the protector she never expected. The isolation that had defined her life, the feeling of being a single woman against a cold, uncaring city, evaporated. She realized that she was no longer a waitress drowning in a sea of glass towers. She was the matriarch of a very different kind of family. "I think I'll keep the pink uniform," Monique said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking across her face. "It reminds me of where we started." "Keep it," Dong Chul agreed, his eyes reflecting the morning sun. "But from now on, you only wear it when you want to, not because you have to." As the first customers of the day began to trickle in, neighborhood regulars who stared in awe at the Rolls-Royces parked at the curb and the men in suits, Monique felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since she was a child. She turned on the radio, and the sounds of soulful jazz filled the room, blending with the sizzle of the grill. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a woman who had bet on kindness in a world of cruelty, and against all odds, her bet had paid off. As she poured the first cup of coffee for a regular, she didn't look at the tip jar. She looked at the gold dragon on her collar, and then at the back door, knowing that the shadows were gone for good. Monique Harris was no longer alone. She was home, and the world finally knew her name. I'd appreciate your thoughts in the comments. If you found this useful, please consider leaving a like.